The morning Margaret Ashby arrived at Thornfield Manor, the housekeeper whispered to the footman, "Don't bother learning her name. She won't last the season." She lasted 7 years. And when she finally left, the Duke rode after her himself. No coat, no hat, just a man who had run out of time to pretend he didn't care. But that is the end of the story. This is the beginning. The carriage that brought Margaret Ashby to Thornfield Manor was not the Duke's carriage. It was a hired one, narrow, smelling of damp wool and someone else's journey. And it arrived not at the front entrance, where the gravel had been freshly raked and the stone lion stood in clean pairs, but at the side gate, near the kitchen garden, where the mud was deep and nobody had thought to lay boards across it. Margaret noticed all of this. She noticed the way the footman who met her looked past her shoulder first, checking whether someone more important might be behind her. She noticed the way he took her single trunk without a word and started walking before she had fully stepped down from the carriage. She noticed the heavy gray sky pressing down over the manor's east wing, and the one dark window on the uppermost floor where a curtain moved and then went still. Someone had been watching for her. She pulled her coat closer and followed the footman inside. The housekeeper's name was Mrs. Partridge, and she had worked at Thornfield for 22 years. In that time she had managed 4 renovations, 2 deaths, 1 disastrous Christmas party, and any number of difficult guests. She was not a cruel woman, but she was a practical one, and practicality had taught her not to invest in things that were unlikely to last. She looked Margaret over once, the plain traveling dress, the sensible boots, the face that was neither ugly nor remarkable, and made her calculations quickly. Charity case, she thought. Orphan. Here because the old will said she had to be. Gone before midsummer. "Your room is on the 3rd floor of the east wing," Mrs. Partridge said, already turning to lead the way. "You'll take meals with the household at the regular hours. The Duke does not require your company at dinner unless specifically invited. You are not to enter the West Library without permission. Any questions?" "Just one," Margaret said. Mrs. Partridge paused. "Is there a fire laid in the room, or shall I arrange for one myself?" Mrs. Partridge looked at her for a moment. "There is a hearth," she said. "Whether it draws properly is another matter." "I see," said Margaret. "Thank you." She asked nothing else. The room was exactly what she had expected. Small, though not oppressively so. A single window facing north, which meant no afternoon light and considerable cold. A wardrobe with a door that didn't sit quite straight. A washstand with a hairline crack running up the basin. And in the corner, set at an angle as though someone had placed it there without thinking and never thought about it again, a chair. Wooden. High-backed. Its right rear leg wrapped in a rag and propped unevenly against the baseboard. Margaret set down her traveling bag. She crossed the room. She crouched beside the chair, unwrapped the rag, and examined the leg. A clean split, not a rot. The wood was still good. She looked around the room, found nothing useful, and went back to her trunk. At the very bottom, beneath her winter shawl and her father's last account book, she found what she was looking for. A small roll of linen bandaging, left over from the months she had spent nursing him. She wrapped the leg herself, tightly, properly. Then she stood up, pressed her weight down on the chair's seat with both hands and tested it. It held. She sat down. From this angle she could see the full length of the room, the uneven hearth, the crooked wardrobe door, the pale square on the wall where a painting had hung and been removed. She could also see, if she turned slightly, the corner of the north window and a narrow slice of the grounds below. Bare trees, a gravel path, and at the far end of it, a man standing alone with his back to the house, looking out over the frozen fields. She did not know yet that he was the Duke. She only knew that he stood very still for a very long time, like a man who had somewhere to go and had decided, for reasons she couldn't guess, not to go there. Then he turned and walked back toward the house, and Margaret turned away from the window, and that was how it began. She had fixed the chair. She did not yet know what else in that house was broken, but she would find out. Margaret had been at Thornfield for 4 days before anyone spoke to her voluntarily. The maids nodded when they passed her in the corridor. The footman looked through her. Mrs. Partridge gave instructions in the clipped, efficient tone one uses with someone who is neither guest nor staff, and therefore fits nowhere comfortably. Margaret accepted all of this without complaint. She had learned in the years of managing her father's failing estate that a new household was like a new language. You did not speak until you understood the grammar. So she watched. She watched for a week. It was the kitchen ledger that she noticed first. She had not gone looking for it. She had simply been passing through the back corridor on her way to the garden. Mrs. Partridge had mentioned once that she was welcome to use it for walking, when she heard the cook, a broad-shouldered Scotswoman named Mrs. Beale, arguing with herself over a column of numbers at the kitchen table. Margaret stopped in the doorway. "The flour delivery," she said. Mrs. Beale looked up sharply. "I beg your pardon." The third line from the bottom. "You've been charged for 40 pounds of flour. Your notation on the left says 32. That's an 8-pound discrepancy at current prices, nearly 3 shillings. Margaret paused. "Has it happened before?" Mrs. Beale stared at her. Then she looked down at the ledger, then back up. "Every month," she said slowly, "for I don't know how long." "Then it wants correcting," Margaret said. "If you'd like, I can help you draft a letter to the supplier." She said it the way one mentions the weather, matter-of-factly, without any suggestion that she was doing anyone a favor. Mrs. Beale, who had been fighting this ledger alone for the better part of 2 years, looked at Margaret Ashby for a long moment. "Come in then," she said. "Sit down. Word travels differently in a household than it does in society. In society, gossip moves in drawing rooms and at dinner tables, wrapped in lowered voices and raised eyebrows. In a household, it moves through doorways and along staircases, between the woman who carries the coal and the man who tends the lamps, quick and plain and largely accurate. By the end of that week, the staff of Thornfield knew 3 things about Margaret Ashby. First, she had found the flour discrepancy. Second, she had noticed, without being asked, that the library's east-facing window had a crack in the upper pane that let in a thin, constant draft, and had mentioned it quietly to the head footman, Thomas, who had mentioned it to the estate manager, who had gone to look and found that, yes, it had been there since autumn and the cold damage to the shelving beneath it was already beginning. Third, she had learned the name of every member of the household staff within her first 5 days, not just the senior ones, all of them, including the young hall boy, barely 12, who everyone called simply the boy because no one had bothered to ask his given name in the 3 months he'd been there. His name was Peter. Margaret had asked. None of this reached the Duke directly. Richard Ashford, 6th Duke of Thornfield, was not a man who concerned himself with household particulars. That was what he paid Mrs. Partridge for. His own days moved in a fixed and deliberate pattern: correspondence in the morning, estate business in the early afternoon, riding when the weather allowed, and in the evenings a silence that the staff had long since learned not to disturb. He was not, as far as Margaret could observe, a happy man. But he was not a simple one either, and she had been careful not to mistake coldness for stupidity. He noticed things. She had seen it, the way his eyes moved across a room when he entered it, the slight pause before he spoke that suggested he had already calculated several possible answers. He was a man who paid attention and then chose, quite deliberately, what to do with what he saw. What he chose to do with Margaret Ashby, for the time being, was nothing at all. She accepted this. It was on a Thursday afternoon, 11 days after her arrival, that she encountered him directly for the first time. She had been in the garden, the walled kitchen garden, frost-gray and mostly bare, but with a south-facing corner that caught enough pale winter sun to be almost pleasant. She had brought a book. She was sitting on the stone bench reading it when she heard footsteps on the gravel path and looked up. The Duke stopped when he saw her. Just briefly, a fraction of a second's hesitation, the kind a man makes when he finds something in a place he didn't expect it. "Miss Ashby," he said. "Your Grace," she said, and started to rise. He made a small gesture, not quite don't bother but close enough, and walked on past her toward the far gate. Margaret watched him go. He moved like a man with somewhere to be, but when he reached the gate he didn't open it. He stood with one hand resting on the iron latch and looked out at the fields beyond, the same way she had seen him from her window on the first day. After a moment she went back to her book. Neither of them spoke again. But when she looked up once more, a few minutes later, she found that he had turned slightly, not enough to be facing her, but enough that if he had wanted to, he could have been watching her without her knowing. She didn't know what to make of that. She filed it away, the way she filed everything, and turned the page. It was Mrs. Beale who warned her that same evening over the corrected ledger. "There's a woman," Mrs. Beale said without looking up from the page. "Lady Vivienne Holt. She comes and goes. She'll be here for the winter party next month, most like." She paused. "She won't be pleased to find you here." "Why not?" Margaret asked. Mrs. Beale looked at her then, a long, measuring look, as though deciding how plainly to speak. "Because she's been the most important woman at Thornfield for 2 years," she said, "and she has a talent for staying that way." Margaret considered this. "I'm not here to be important," she said. "No," said Mrs. Beale, "but that won't matter to her." That night Margaret sat in the repaired chair by the cold hearth. The flu still drew badly, and she had not yet found the right moment to mention it to the right person, and thought about what Mrs. Beale had said. She was not afraid of Lady Vivienne Holt. She had managed creditors who came to the door before breakfast. She had sat across a solicitor's table and listened to a man explain, in careful legal language, that her father had died with nothing. She had packed up a house she had lived in for 23 years and fit everything that mattered into a single trunk. A woman who did not want her here was not, by any measure, the worst thing Margaret Ashby had faced. She picked up her book. Outside, the wind moved across the frozen fields, and somewhere in the west wing of the house, a door closed heavily and Thornfield Manor settled into the particular quiet of a place that has too many rooms and not enough warmth. Margaret read until the candle burned low. Then she went asleep. The household had seen her now. Lady Vivienne was coming, and the Duke was just beginning to look up from the gate. Lady Vivienne Holt arrived on a Friday. Margaret knew she was coming before anyone told her. She knew because the house changed. Not loudly, not with any single dramatic signal, but in the way a room changes when a window is opened on a cold day. Everything tightened. The maids moved faster and spoke less. Thomas the footman stopped making small jokes in the corridor. Mrs. Partridge, already a precise woman, became almost mechanical, her instructions clipped to single syllables, her eyes moving constantly over surfaces checking for anything that wasn't perfect. Even Peter, the hall boy, seemed to shrink slightly inside his uniform. Margaret watched all of this and understood it for what it was. Fear, she thought, not of the woman herself, of what she notices, of what she says about what she notices. She filed that away too. Lady Vivienne was beautiful in the way that certain expensive things are beautiful, deliberately, completely, with no detail left to chance. She arrived in the Duke's own carriage, which Margaret noted, and swept into the entrance hall in a traveling coat the color of dark wine, and kissed the Duke on both cheeks in the French manner, and looked around the hall with the calm, possessive gaze of a woman surveying something that belongs to her. Her eyes found Margaret in approximately 4 seconds. Margaret was standing near the base of the staircase. She had not planned to be there. She had simply been crossing from one side of the hall to the other when the doors opened. There was no graceful way to retreat, so she stood still. Lady Vivienne looked at her, the way one looks at a piece of furniture that has been moved to an inconvenient location. "And this," she said, not to Margaret but to the Duke, "is the ward." It was not a question. It was a category, a filing system. This is the ward meaning. This is the thing that must be accommodated, like a drafty window or a poorly positioned chair. "Miss Margaret Ashby," the Duke said. His voice was neutral, uninformative. Lady Vivienne smiled at Margaret, a full, warm, practiced smile that had nothing behind it. "How lovely," she said. Then she turned back to the Duke and began talking about London. Margaret went upstairs. The winter dinner party was held on the following Saturday. 23 guests, 3 courses plus removes. The long dining table laid with the good silver, the tall candles, the crystal that caught the light and threw small rainbows across the white tablecloth. Margaret had seen grander tables in her childhood before everything collapsed, and she felt no particular awe. What she felt, when she came downstairs in her best dress, dark green wool, 3 years old but well kept, her mother's small pearl earrings, was a quiet and private determination to simply get through the evening without incident. She found her place card at the far end of the table. She stood beside it for a moment and read the names around her. To her left, Sir Edmund Graves, who was 74 years old and almost entirely deaf. To her right, Reverend Hollies, who was pleasant enough but had not quite met her eyes since the rumors had begun circulating in the village, rumors she had not yet fully mapped but could feel at the edges of conversations, like a cold draft from an unseen crack. At the head of the table, Lady Vivienne sat 2 seats from the Duke. Margaret sat down, placed her napkin in her lap, and smiled at Sir Edmund, who smiled back with the cheerful blankness of a man who had made his peace with not hearing most of what was said to him. It's all right, she told herself. It's one evening. The first 2 courses passed without event. Margaret spoke to the Reverend about the village church's restoration fund, which she had read about in the local paper. She spoke to Sir Edmund about his garden, raising her voice slightly and facing him directly, which he appreciated enough to pat her hand twice and call her a good girl. She ate what was placed in front of her. She did not look toward the head of the table more than twice. It was during the 3rd course that it happened. The conversation at the upper end of the table had grown louder wine and warmth, and the particular looseness that comes over a dinner party in its 2nd hour. Lady Vivienne was holding court, as she did naturally and well, her laugh carrying down the table like a bell. Then, in a gap between conversations, she turned. "Miss Ashby," she said clearly. 23 heads did not all turn at once, but enough of them did. Margaret looked up. Lady Vivienne held her wine glass up, tilting it slightly, with the smile of a woman who has just had a charming idea. "We seem to be running rather low at this end. Would you mind?" She nodded toward the sideboard against the wall, the decanter of claret, the white-gloved footman standing 6 feet away from it, entirely capable of pouring. The table went quiet in the particular way of people who understand exactly what is happening and are waiting to see what will be done about it. Margaret looked at Lady Vivienne, then at the sideboard, then at the footman who was looking at the floor. She stood up. She crossed to the sideboard. She lifted the decanter. It was heavy, good crystal, nearly full, and she walked back to the table. She began at the far end, at Sir Edmund's glass, and she moved slowly and steadily up the length of the table, filling each glass in turn. She did not rush. She did not spill. She kept her back straight and her face entirely composed, and when she reached Lady Vivienne, she filled her glass last, with the same steady hand, and set the decanter down on the table within easy reach. Then she returned to her seat. The room was silent. And then from somewhere in the middle of the table, from a small, straight-backed woman of perhaps 70 with white hair and very bright eyes, a woman Margaret had not been introduced to, came a sound. It was soft, deliberate, the sound of one pair of gloved hands beginning to clap. The Duchess of Aldermere. Margaret would learn her name afterward. She was clapping slowly, with a slight smile, looking not at Lady Vivienne but at Margaret, the way one looks at something that has confirmed a suspicion. 1 or 2 others joined in, uncertainly. Lady Vivienne's smile did not falter. She was too skilled for that. But something behind it shifted, a micro-adjustment, a recalculation, and when she raised her newly filled glass and said, "How perfectly efficient," with a light laugh, the words landed in the room and did not quite land right. Margaret picked up her fork. Sir Edmund patted her hand again. The Duke had not spoken. Margaret had not looked at him during any of it, not when Lady Vivienne called her name, not when she stood, not when she walked the length of the table. She had been careful about that. She had understood instinctively that looking at him would have meant something, would have been a kind of appeal, a request for rescue, and she did not make requests of men who had given her no reason to trust them. But as the dinner moved on and the conversation rebuilt itself around the incident like water closing over a stone, she became aware, not by looking, but by some other sense entirely, that he had not gone back to his conversation as quickly as the others had. That he was still, for a moment longer than was natural, looking down the table. At her. She reached for her water glass and did not look back. Later, much later, after the guests had moved to the drawing room and Margaret had excused herself early with a headache that was only partly invented, she sat in the repaired chair in her cold room and thought about the evening with the same methodical calm she applied to ledgers and leaking windows. Lady Vivienne had meant to humiliate her. That was plain. There was no other reading of it. What was less plain, what she turned over carefully in her mind like an unfamiliar coin, was the Duke's silence. He had said nothing when it happened, nothing afterward as far as she knew. He had watched and been still and said nothing. She could not yet decide if that was the same as doing nothing. She thought about the Duchess of Aldermere's slow clap, the bright eyes, the slight smile. She thought about the footman who had looked at the floor. She thought about Peter, the hall boy who had been waiting in the corridor when she came upstairs and had said, very quietly, "You were very good tonight, miss," before disappearing around the corner. Margaret leaned her head back against the chair. Outside, the winter wind pressed against the north window, and the hearth gave its usual inadequate warmth, and Thornfield Manor was quiet in the way it was always quiet, too many rooms, not enough life in them. He said nothing, she thought. Remember that. The household had seen her. Lady Vivienne had shown her hand, and the Duke, who had said nothing, was beginning to understand that silence had a cost. The snowstorm arrived on a Tuesday without much warning. There had been signs, a particular heaviness to the sky the previous evening, the way the horses in the stable had grown restless before supper, the cold that had shifted overnight from merely sharp to something deeper and more serious. But the full weight of it came down before dawn, and by the time the household woke, Thornfield Manor was an island. The drive was impassable. The lane to the village was gone entirely, buried under 2 feet of white that was still coming down in thick, determined curtains. The last of the dinner party guests had left on Sunday. Lady Vivienne had returned to London on Monday morning, in a flurry of luggage and instructions, and a farewell to the Duke that Margaret had not witnessed, but had heard described by 2 different maids in 2 different versions, neither of which she found particularly interesting. The house was quiet, and for the first time since her arrival, Margaret Ashby and Richard Ashford, 6th Duke of Thornfield, were the only 2 people in it who sat down to meals. The first breakfast was uncomfortable. Not hostile, simply uncomfortable, in the manner of 2 people who have been placed in proximity without their consent and are both too self-possessed to fill the silence with noise they don't mean. The Duke read correspondence. Margaret had brought her book. Mrs. Beale sent up porridge and toast and a pot of strong tea, and the fire in the breakfast room was the best Margaret had sat near since her arrival, and she was almost warm. The Duke set down a letter. "You're reading Gibbon," he said. Margaret looked up. He was looking at the spine of her book with an expression she couldn't quite read, not disapproval, not surprise exactly, something more like recalibration. "The 3rd volume," she said. "You've read the first 2. And the second twice," she paused. "The footnotes are better the second time." Something moved across his face, a flicker, quickly suppressed. "Most people find Gibbon impenetrable." "Most people try to read him quickly," she said. "He doesn't reward that." The Duke looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his next letter. But he did not, she noticed, go back to reading it immediately. By the second day they had, without discussing it, established a kind of accidental routine. Breakfast together, largely silent but no longer uncomfortably so. The Duke disappeared to his study in the mornings. Margaret read, or helped Mrs. Beale with the storm provisions, or sat with Peter in the kitchen corridor teaching him his letters, which she had discovered he did not know, and which no one had apparently thought to address. In the afternoons the Duke sometimes emerged, and they existed in the same rooms, the library, the sitting room off the main hall, with a careful, mutual respect for each other's quiet. On the second evening he came into the library while she was there and did not leave. He took a book from the shelf without looking at her and sat in the chair by the window, the good one, the leather one that had clearly been his for years, worn soft at the arms, and read. Margaret read. The fire was adequate. Outside the snow continued its slow, indifferent work. After perhaps an hour he said, without looking up, "The library window is being repaired in the spring. The east pane." "I'm glad," Margaret said. "Thomas mentioned you'd noticed it." "It was difficult to miss. The draft was moving the pages." A pause. "You might have mentioned it to me directly." Margaret considered this. "I didn't think that was the appropriate channel," she said carefully. He looked up then. "And what is the appropriate channel in your estimation?" "For a window, the estate manager." She met his eyes. "For something else, I suppose it would depend on the something else." He held her gaze for a moment, a beat longer than was strictly conversational, then went back to his book. Margaret went back to hers. It was on the third evening that she found him with the letter. She had come into the study to return a map she had borrowed. She had been trying to understand the layout of the estate grounds, which were larger than she had initially calculated. And she knocked, and he said, "Come in," and she entered to find him sitting at his desk with a letter in his hand, and an expression on his face she had not seen before. He was not reading it. He was looking at it the way one looks at something that has been sitting in the same place for a very long time, waiting. Margaret set the map down on the corner of the desk. She turned to go. "Miss Ashby," she stopped. "Does it seem to you," he said, still looking at the letter, "that there are things a person can put off indefinitely, and then one day find they cannot put off any longer, and not be entirely sure how that day arrived?" It was an odd thing to say. He seemed to know it was odd. There was a slight tension in his jaw, the look of a man who has said something he hadn't planned to. Margaret didn't pretend she hadn't heard it. She turned back. "Yes," she said simply. "What is the letter?" He looked up at that. She suspected people did not usually ask him direct questions. "It's from my son," he said. She had not known about the son. Nothing in the household had prepared her for it. No portraits in the corridor she had seen. No mention from Mrs. Beale or Thomas or anyone else, which itself, she now understood, was a kind of answer. His name was James. He was 10 years old. He was at school in Yorkshire, had been there for 2 years, and before that had been largely in the care of a nurse in the North House, which was a secondary property Margaret had heard mentioned once in passing. The Duke told her this in the flat, careful voice of a man reciting facts he has organized specifically to avoid the spaces between them. "He writes every few months," the Duke said. "This one arrived before the storm. I've been meaning to read it." "But you haven't." "No." Margaret looked at him. He was turned slightly away from her, his profile to the fire, and she could see the exact quality of stillness in him. Not the stillness of a man who felt nothing, but of a man who had spent a great deal of energy learning to hold things in place. "Why not?" she asked. The question landed in the room quietly. He turned to look at her, and she saw it cross his face, the slight surprise, and then beneath it something older and less defended. "Because," he said after a moment, "I am not certain what to say back." "To a 10-year-old boy." "To my son," he said, and in the way he said it, the slight weight on the word, the pause before it, she understood that the problem was not the letter at all. The problem was everything the letter represented. 2 years at school, years before that in a North House with a nurse. A boy who wrote every few months to a father who had not written back often enough, or warmly enough, or perhaps at all. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "May I ask what happened to his mother?" "She died," he said, "when James was 3, a pause. It was very sudden." "I'm sorry." He nodded once, the brief, compressed nod of someone who has accepted condolences enough times that the gesture has become reflexive. "After that," he said slowly, "I found I didn't know what to do with a child. I knew how to manage an estate. I knew how to manage people. A 3-year-old boy who looked exactly like his mother." He stopped, set the letter down on the desk. "I made arrangements. They were good arrangements. He was well cared for." "But you didn't go to him." "No." And he kept writing. The Duke looked at the letter. "Yes," he said quietly. He kept writing. The fire shifted. Outside, the snow had finally, after 3 days, begun to slow. Margaret could hear the difference in the quality of the wind, something loosening in it. She looked at the man across the desk. Not the Duke, just then. Just a man sitting with a letter he couldn't open, and a grief he had never properly set down, carrying it so long he had mistaken the weight of it for his own bones. "Read it tonight," she said. "You don't have to know what to say back yet, just read it." He looked at her. "He's 10, she said. "He just wants to know you're there." She left him with the letter. She did not know, as she walked back down the corridor to the east wing, whether he would open it. She did not know what it meant that he had told her any of it, whether it was the storm, or the enforced proximity, or simply that 3 days of accidental honesty had worn down something in him that was usually more carefully maintained. She knew only that when she reached her room and sat down in the repaired chair, the cold hearth in front of her, she felt something she had not felt since arriving at Thornfield. Not pity. She was careful about pity. It was a condescending emotion, and she had been on the receiving end of it enough to know its shape. Not sympathy exactly, either. Something more like recognition. A person can put off indefinitely, and then one day find they cannot. She knew that particular day. She had had her own version of it, sitting across a solicitor's table while a man explained her father's debts in careful legal language. The moment when the distance she'd been keeping between herself and a difficult truth finally collapsed. She had survived that day. She wondered, quietly and without drama, whether anyone had ever told him that it was possible to survive it. She rather suspected no one had thought to. In the morning, the snow had stopped. The Duke came to breakfast before her for the first time. He was already seated when she entered, and there was something different about him, not dramatic, not visible to anyone who hadn't been paying close attention for the past 3 days. But Margaret had been paying close attention. He looked, she thought, like a man who had slept. He did not mention the letter. She did not ask. But when Mrs. Beale brought the tea and he reached for his correspondence, he set the stack aside after a moment and said, without particular preamble, "James is fond of astronomy. He's been asking his teacher about telescopes." Margaret poured her tea. "There are worse things to be fond of," she said. "No," he agreed, "there aren't." He said it almost to himself, looking at some middle distance, and there was something in it, something unguarded and almost wondering, like a man finding a room in his own house he'd forgotten was there. Margaret drank her tea and did not remark on it. Some things were better left to breathe. The storm had passed. Lady Vivienne was returning, and the Duke had read the letter. Margaret did not yet know what any of that would cost her. Lady Vivienne came back on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the storm. The roads had cleared. The sky had that particular brittle brightness of an English winter giving way, reluctantly, to the idea of spring, still cold, but with a different quality to the light, something less determined about the gray. Margaret had been at Thornfield for nearly 2 months by then. She had learned the house's rhythms the way you learn a piece of music, not by studying it but by living inside it long enough that it becomes familiar without your noticing. She had also, without quite meaning to, learned the Duke's rhythms. The way he took his coffee black and his breakfast early. The way he stood at the study window when he was thinking through something difficult, hands behind his back, weight slightly forward. The way he sometimes paused in corridors, outside the library, outside the breakfast room, as though adjusting himself before entering, like a man who had learned to compose his face before presenting it to the world. She had learned these things the way one learns anything observed closely over time, involuntarily, and with a kind of helpless accuracy. She had also noticed, though she had said nothing about it to anyone, that he had begun writing letters in the evenings. She didn't know this for certain. She knew only that twice when she had passed the study after dinner the light was still on and she could hear, faintly, the particular silence of a man thinking between sentences. And once Thomas had mentioned in passing that a letter had gone out to Yorkshire. She had filed that away. She had become, she thought with a private wryness, very good at filing things away. Lady Vivienne arrived at noon. She was in better spirits than her previous visit, or performing better spirits, which in Margaret's observation amounted to the same thing with Lady Vivienne. She brought London news and a new hat and two friends, a Lord and Lady Pembroke, who were pleasant enough and who looked at Margaret when they were introduced with the polite, incurious gaze of people who have been told nothing about her and require nothing. The afternoon passed without incident. It was at dinner that Margaret first felt it, a change in the atmosphere, fine as a shift in barometric pressure. Lady Vivienne was charming and warm and attentive to everyone at the table, including Margaret, which was itself the signal. When Lady Vivienne was warm to Margaret, it meant she was building towards something. Margaret ate her soup and waited. The something arrived 2 days later from an unexpected direction. She was walking back from the village. She had taken to walking in the mornings, sometimes as far as the church and back, which Mrs. Beale had encouraged on the grounds that fresh air was improving, when she passed 2 women from the village she recognized by sight. They were standing outside the draper's shop, and they fell quiet when they saw her, and one of them looked away with a particular deliberateness that Margaret recognized immediately. Not embarrassment, not rudeness. The discomfort of people who know something about you that you don't yet know yourself. She walked on. She kept her pace even. She nodded pleasantly to the vicar's wife, who nodded back with a smile that was 3 degrees too careful. By the time she reached the manor gates, she had assembled the outline of it, the way you assemble a broken thing from its scattered pieces. A rumor, she thought, and not a small one. Mrs. Beale told her that evening in the kitchen, with the directness of a woman who believed that a clean cut was kinder than a slow one. "It's being said in the village," Mrs. Beale said, not looking up from the pastry she was working, "that you are here not as a ward, that the arrangement between you and the Duke is a different kind of arrangement." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "How widely?" she asked. "Wide enough." Mrs. Beale pressed the pastry flat with one firm stroke. "The butcher mentioned it to Thomas yesterday. It's been in the village at least a week, maybe more." "And in the house?" "The house knows better." A pause. "Most of the house." Margaret looked at the table. She thought about the vicar's wife's careful smile, the women outside the drapers, the invitations she had had too in recent weeks from ladies in the neighboring estates, modest friendly notes suggesting afternoon calls. She thought about whether those invitations would still come. She already knew the answer. "Lady Vivienne," she said. It was not a question. Mrs. Beale said nothing, which was itself an answer. She went to the Duke the next morning. She chose the morning deliberately after breakfast, before he withdrew to his study, when he was still in the hall with the day's correspondence under his arm. She said, "I need to speak with you. It won't take long." He looked at her face and said, "Come in." She told him plainly. She did not dress it up or soften it or approach it from an angle. She told him what was being said, where it was being said, and for approximately how long. She told him about the women outside the drapers and the vicar's wife and the quality of the silence when she walked into certain rooms. He listened without interrupting. His expression did not change in any way she could read. When she finished, he said, "I see." "I would like you to correct it," she said, "publicly. In writing, if possible, a note to the relevant families, a word to the vicar. Something clear and unambiguous that establishes what I am here and what I am not." He was quiet for a moment. "That would require," he said carefully, "a direct address of the matter." Yes, which would imply that I had heard the rumor. You have heard the rumor, I've just told you. And addressing it directly, he paused, set the correspondence down on the hall table, would put Lady Vivienne in a difficult position. Margaret looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he seemed to become aware of it, to feel the weight of it. And she thought about the dinner party and the wine, and the walk up the length of the table with the decanter. She thought about the women outside the drapers. She thought about the 3 days of snowstorm and Gibbon and a letter from a boy in Yorkshire, and a man who had said I am not certain what to say back with an expression she had recognized as grief. She thought, I was wrong to recognize it. I was wrong to let it matter. Yes, she said quietly, I imagine it would. She turned to go. Miss Ashby, she stopped. She did not turn around. I will consider it, he said. Of course, she said. She walked upstairs. She packed the trunk that afternoon. Not frantically, not in tears or in anger, though the anger was there, low and steady, a banked fire. She packed methodically, the way she did everything, folding each item carefully, her father's account book going in last, at the bottom, the way it always did. She worked through the afternoon and into the early evening, and when she was done, she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the closed trunk and felt, for the first time since arriving at Thornfield, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been careful for a very long time. She had been so careful. She had not complained about the room or the cold or the hearth. She had not made herself a burden or a problem. She had fixed the things that needed fixing, quietly, practically, without fanfare, and she had asked for nothing except to be treated as what she was, a woman of decent birth and decent character who deserved to be here as much as anyone else in this house. And it had not been enough. It is never enough, said the voice in her head that sounded like the solicitor across the table, like the creditors at the door, like every moment in her life when the ground had shifted and she had found herself on the wrong side of it. It is never quite enough, no matter how careful you are. She sat with that for a while. Then she stood up, straightened her back, and went to write a letter. The letter from the Duchess of Aldermere arrived the following morning. Margaret had not expected it, had not, in truth, thought of the small, bright-eyed woman since the dinner party, beyond a general warmth when she did. But the letter was there on the hall table with her name on it in a sharp, clear hand, and she took it upstairs and read it by the north window. It was direct, as she suspected the Duchess always was. I have heard certain things being said. The letter began without preamble, which I do not believe and which I imagine you do not deserve. I am going to Bath in a fortnight's time. I am old and I am sometimes lonely, and I would very much benefit from the company of a sensible young woman who reads Gibbon and does not say only what people want to hear. If you are amenable, the position is yours. The pay is modest, but the library is excellent. Margaret read it twice. Then she sat for a long time with the letter in her lap and looked out the north window at the bare trees and the pale sky and the gravel path below where, on her first day, she had seen a man standing at the gate looking out at fields. He seemed reluctant to leave. She thought about what it would mean to go. She thought about what it would mean to stay. Then she went downstairs and told Mrs. Partridge to have the carriage arranged for Monday morning. She did not tell the Duke. She did not think he had earned the courtesy of advance notice. But that evening, her second to last at Thornfield as she understood it, she passed the study and saw the light under the door and heard the particular silence of a man between sentences, and she stopped in the corridor for just a moment with her hand not quite raised to knock. Then she walked on. Some things were better left unfinished, or so she told herself. The trunk was packed. The carriage was arranged. And the Duke, in his study, was writing a letter to Yorkshire, not yet knowing that the woman who had asked him why was about to walk out of his house forever. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, and entirely indifferent to the situation. Margaret was dressed by 6. Her trunk was at the door of the east wing room by 1:30. She had stripped the bed, an instinct, the habit of someone who had always cleaned up after herself because there was no one else to do it, and folded the linens at the foot of the mattress. She had taken nothing that wasn't hers. She had left the room exactly as she had found it, with one exception: the chair. She had considered briefly taking it. It was a small thing. No one would have noticed. But in the end she left it where it was, in the corner, repaired, the linen wrapping still tight around the leg because it had been broken when she arrived, and she had fixed it, and it belonged to the house, and she was not in the habit of taking things that belonged to other people, no matter how much work she had put into them. She picked up her traveling bag. She did not look back at the room. She went downstairs. The carriage was in the drive at 7, the hired one again. She had not asked for the Duke's, had not wanted it. Thomas was there, and he helped with her trunk without meeting her eyes, which she understood. Peter was there too, appearing suddenly from the direction of the kitchen corridor in his oversized uniform, his face carrying the stricken look of a child who has been told something is happening and doesn't know what to do about it. "You're going," he said. "I am," she said. "Will you come back?" She looked at him, this boy with his untied bootlaces and his slowly improving letters, and his name that no one had bothered to ask before she arrived. She crouched down slightly so she was at his level. "Keep practicing your letters," she said. "Every day, will you do that?" He nodded, unhappy. "Good," she straightened. "You're going to be fine, Peter." She got into the carriage. The drive from the front entrance to the main gates was approximately a quarter-mile. Margaret knew this because she had walked it many times in both directions, in all weathers. She knew the exact point where the gravel gave way to packed earth, and the oak tree on the left side with the branch that grew almost horizontally, and the place near the gate where in wet weather the ground turned soft and the carriage wheels always slowed. They were at the oak tree when the carriage stopped. Not gradually, not the slow deceleration of a coachman given a signal in advance. A sudden stop, the horses pulling up short, and Margaret put out a hand to steady herself against the forward seat and looked out the window. A horse on the path, a single rider. No hat, no gloves that she could see. His coat was on but not properly fastened, the lapels pulled unevenly as though he had put it on while moving, and his hair was not the carefully arranged thing it usually was in the mornings, but simply his hair, without ceremony. He had, she understood, come from the house at speed. He dismounted. He came to the carriage door and opened it himself without waiting for the coachman, and stood there in the cold gray morning looking at her. She looked back. She waited. He did not make a speech. She would think about this later, would think about it many times, in fact, in the weeks and months that followed, and she would decide that it was the thing that mattered most. Not what he said, but what he didn't do. He didn't explain himself at length or construct an argument or present his case with the organized logic he brought to everything else. He simply stood there, coat half fastened, breath visible in the cold air, and said, "I corrected it." She looked at him. "Yesterday," he said, "in writing, to every name on the list, the vicar, the Pembrokes, the families in the neighboring estates. I wrote to each of them individually. I stated clearly what you are here and what you are not. I stated that the rumor was false and that any person who repeated it would have cause to regret my attention." He paused. "I should have done it the moment I heard. I didn't, and I am not going to offer you an explanation for that because I don't think the explanation reflects well on me." Margaret said nothing. "The Duchess of Aldermere is a good woman," he said. "The position she's offered you is a real one, and I have no right to ask you not to take it." Another pause, shorter, tighter. "I'm asking anyway." Outside, the oak tree stood in the gray morning, and the horses shifted, and the cold pressed down equally on everything. "Why?" Margaret said. He looked at her, and she saw it again, that thing she had seen by firelight in the study with the letter in his hand. The undefended version, the man underneath the management. "Because the house is different with you in it," he said. "Because you asked me why, and no one had done that before, and I read the letter and I wrote back, and James is coming home for Easter." He stopped, seemed to reassemble himself slightly. "Because there is a chair in the east wing that you repaired with linen bandaging from your own trunk on the first day you arrived, and I find that I can't, He stopped again. "Can't what?" she said quietly. "I can't watch you leave," he said. "I find I simply can't do it." She didn't say yes. She wanted to be clear about that afterward. She did not step out of the carriage and take his hand and say, "I'll stay," in the manner of a woman who has been waiting to be asked. That was not who she was, and it was not what the moment required. What she said was, "I'm going to Bath." He blinked. "I told the Duchess I would come, and I intend to honor that." She held his gaze steadily. "She is expecting me. I don't break my word." A beat. Something moved across his face, the beginning of something painful, and then she said, "I'll be there 2 months, possibly 3. He went very still. "And when I come back," she said, "I would like the room in the east wing to have a functioning hearth. Not adequate, functioning, with proper draw and no smoke and enough warmth that a person can sit in it in January without wearing their coat indoors." He stared at her. "That is my condition," she said. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's your only condition." "It's my first condition," she said. "I'll think of others while I'm in Bath." Something happened to his face then. She would spend considerable time afterward trying to find the right word for it, and the word she kept arriving at, unsatisfying as it seemed for a duke standing coatless on a gravel path on a gray February morning, was relief. Pure, unguarded, almost boyish relief. "The hearth will be fixed," he said. "I'll see to it myself." "Don't see to it yourself," she said. "You'll do it wrong. Ask Thomas, he knows a good mason in the village." A pause. His mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the shape of one uncertain and new. "Yes," he said. "All right." She reached forward and pulled the carriage door closed. She heard him step back. She heard him say something to the coachman. She didn't catch the words. She settled back against the seat and looked out the window as the carriage began to move again, and she did not let herself look back at him standing on the path, though she wanted to. She was almost at the gate when she allowed herself one small thing. She smiled. Not the composed, careful smile she had worn through the dinner party and the vicar's careful nod, and all the long weeks of being nobody in particular in somebody else's house. A real one, private and unwitnessed and entirely her own. Then the gate was behind her and the road to Bath opened ahead, and Margaret Ashby sat up straight and put her face to the window and let herself, for the first time in a very long time, look forward. Back at the manor, the Duke stood on the gravel path for longer than was strictly necessary. Then he went inside. He went directly to the east wing, up the stairs, down the corridor to the small room at the end with the north-facing window. He opened the door and stood in the doorway and looked at the stripped bed and the bare walls and the pale square where a painting had been. And in the corner, the chair, repaired, left behind. He crossed the room and crouched beside it, the way she had crouched on her first day, and he examined the linen wrapping on the leg, tight, careful, thoroughly done. And he stayed there for a moment in the cold room with the inadequate hearth and the thin winter light coming through the north window. Then he stood up. He went downstairs and found Thomas. "There's a mason in the village," he said. "I need the hearth in the east wing room seen to, properly. I want it done before April." Thomas looked at him for just a moment, a flicker of something, quickly suppressed. "Yes, Your Grace," he said. "I'll see to it today." The Duke nodded and walked back to his study. At the kitchen table, Mrs. Beale set down her rolling pin and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a woman who has been patient for a very long time and is beginning to feel it was worth it. In the corridor, Peter stood with his back against the wall and a piece of chalk in his hand, practicing his letters on the small slate Margaret had left for him. He was, for the first time in weeks, smiling. She was gone. The hearth was being fixed, and the Duke sat at his desk and did not pick up his correspondence for a very long time. He was, Margaret would have recognized, thinking between sentences. He was writing a letter. Bath in March was pale gold and cold, and smelled of mineral water and old stone. The Duchess of Aldermere's house was on a quiet crescent near the upper town. A tall, narrow Georgian terrace with a dark green door and window boxes that were just beginning to show the first tentative suggestions of spring. Inside it was warm and slightly cluttered and full of books, which Margaret took as an excellent sign. The Duchess herself was exactly as she had been at the dinner table, bright-eyed, direct, entirely uninterested in performance of any kind. She met Margaret at the door on the first day, looked her over once and said, "Good, you have sensible shoes. We walk every morning at 8. There is tea at 4 and I don't like it weak. Any questions?" "None," said Margaret. "Excellent," said the Duchess. "Come in." The first weeks were quieter than anything Margaret had known in years. Not empty, the Duchess kept a lively enough schedule, with morning calls and afternoon visitors, and a small weekly gathering of elderly friends who played cards badly and argued about everything with tremendous enthusiasm. Margaret accompanied her, assisted her, read to her in the evenings when her eyes were tired, and managed her correspondence with the same quiet efficiency she had applied to everything else. But in the spaces between, in the mornings before the walk and the evenings, after the reading and the long Sunday afternoons when the Duchess napped, and the house settled into its particular Sabbath quiet, Margaret found something she had not had in a very long time. Room. Room to think, room to breathe, room to sit with herself without the constant low-level vigilance that Thornfield had required, the watching and the filing and the careful management of every expression in every room. She walked, she read, she wrote letters. The first letter from the Duke arrived 12 days after she left. She had not expected it so soon. She sat with it unopened for a full 10 minutes, long enough that the Duchess, passing through the sitting room with her morning tea, raised an eyebrow and said, "A letter that requires preparation is either very good news or very bad news. In my experience, it is usually both." Then she walked on without waiting for an answer. Margaret opened the letter. It was not what she had expected. She had braced herself, she realized, for persuasion, for an argument elegantly constructed, for why she should come back sooner than agreed. What she found instead was a letter about a telescope. James, it turned out, had mentioned telescopes in his return letter. He had mentioned them with what the Duke described, in a slightly bemused tone, as considerable enthusiasm and a level of technical detail I was not prepared for. He had written back asking for clarification on several points. James had replied by return post with a diagram. "I find," the Duke wrote, "that I am now in correspondence about the moons of Jupiter with a 10-year-old boy who clearly knows a great deal more about the subject than I do. I am not certain whether this is humbling or instructive. Possibly both. I thought you would want to know, since you asked why." That was nearly the whole letter. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, the mason came on Wednesday. Thomas says the hearth will be finished by the end of the month. He also says to tell you, and I am conveying this with no editorial comment, that Peter has filled 2 slates. Margaret read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the drawer of her writing desk, and went to find the Duchess for the morning walk. The letters came every 10 days or so after that. They were never long. They were never, strictly speaking, romantic. There were no declarations, no eloquent professions, none of the elaborate emotional architecture of the novels she had read. They were practical and honest and occasionally, unexpectedly, funny in the dry, understated way she had first glimpsed in him over breakfast in Gibbon. He told her that James had asked whether he might come home for a weekend before Easter, not waiting for the holiday, and that he had said yes without thinking about it, and then sat with the reality of it for some time afterward. "He arrives on Friday," he wrote. "I have been informed by Mrs. Beale that he has strong opinions about pie, which I did not know. There is apparently a great deal I did not know." He told her that Lady Vivienne had sent a note, cool, correct, final. He mentioned it in a single sentence and did not elaborate, which she appreciated. He told her that he had attempted to repair a loose hinge on the library door himself before remembering her instruction about Thomas, and had then asked Thomas, who had fixed it in 4 minutes. "You were right," he wrote. "I did it wrong." He told her in the 6th letter that the east wing hearth drew perfectly now, that the mason had been thorough and the difference was considerable, that he had gone and stood in the room to check it himself and had found the chair in the corner and had sat in it for a while. "It is," he wrote, "a good chair. Solid. I don't know why I never noticed it before." Margaret sat with that letter for a long time. She wrote back to everyone. She told him about the Duchess's card-playing friends and their magnificent arguments. She told him about the walks and the mineral water and the Georgian architecture, and the bookshop on Milsom Street, where she had found a first edition of something the Duchess had been looking for years, which had produced a reaction of such disproportionate joy that Margaret had laughed for the first time in months, really laughed, surprised out of it. She told him in her 3rd letter that the Duchess had asked about Thornfield with the shrewd directness she applied to everything, and that Margaret had answered honestly, and that the Duchess had listened without comment and then said, "The trouble with difficult men is that they are usually worth it. The question is whether they know it yet." She had not elaborated on whether she was referring to anyone in particular. She told him in her 5th letter that she was glad James had come home for the weekend. She asked what pie they had had. He wrote back, "Steak and kidney. He had 2 helpings. I had 2 helpings." Mrs. Beale appeared to consider this a personal vindication. In her 7th letter she told him that she had been thinking about the estate grounds, the kitchen garden in particular, which she had observed was being underutilized. She had some thoughts about the south-facing wall and what might be grown against it if he was interested. She included a small sketch, done neatly in the margins. His reply came faster than usual. He said he was interested. He asked several practical questions. He also said at the end, "The room is waiting, the hearth works, the chair is still there, I couldn't bring myself to move it." She read that sentence 3 times, then she wrote back, "Good." The 2 months became nearly 3. She had told him possibly 3, and she had meant it. She was not a woman who shortened her commitments because something more appealing presented itself elsewhere. She stayed her full time. She walked every morning. She read to the Duchess in the evenings and managed the correspondence and found 3 more things in the bookshop on Milsom Street that she bought with her own money and carried in her trunk. But in the last week she found herself doing something she hadn't done before, looking forward. Not in the anxious, contingent way she had learned to think about the future during her father's illness, calculating resources, mapping exits, preparing for the next collapse. Something simpler. Something that felt, cautiously and with full awareness of its own fragility, like anticipation. She thought about the kitchen garden and the south-facing wall. She thought about Peter and his slates. She thought about a boy who knew about the moons of Jupiter and had strong opinions about pie. She thought about a man sitting in a repaired chair in a room with a working hearth, between sentences, in the particular silence of someone who has finally found something worth saying. On the morning she left Bath, the Duchess stood at the dark green door and looked at her with those bright eyes that missed nothing. "Well," she said. "Well," said Margaret. "Come and visit me," the Duchess said. "Bring him if you like, though I warn you I will ask him difficult questions." "He'll answer them," Margaret said. "He's better at it than he used to be." The Duchess smiled, not the polite kind, the real kind, the kind that reached all the way up. "Good," she said. She took Margaret's hand and pressed it once firmly. "Now go." She arrived at Thornfield on a Wednesday afternoon. The carriage, the Duke's carriage this time, which he had sent without being asked, came up the main drive and stopped at the front entrance, where the gravel had been freshly raked and the stone lion stood in clean pairs. The front door opened before she had fully stepped down. Not Mrs. Partridge, Peter. He was standing in the doorway in his uniform with both bootlaces tied. She noticed that immediately, holding himself with the particular pride of a boy who has been entrusted with something important and intends to do it correctly. He had a slate under his arm. "Miss Ashby," he said very seriously. "Peter," she said equally seriously. He held up the slate. On it in chalk, in handwriting that was still uneven but entirely legible, "Welcome home." She looked at it for a moment. "Two slates," she said. He grinned, the whole-face grin of a child who has abandoned ceremony. "Three now," he said. "Mrs. Beale says I can have 4 by summer if I keep on." "You'll have 6, Margaret said. She went inside. The Duke was in the hall. He was not pretending to do something else, not holding correspondence, not consulting with Thomas, not positioned at a studied distance with a careful expression. He was simply standing there, waiting, in the way of a man who has decided that pretending to be otherwise occupied is a waste of everyone's time. He looked at her. She looked at him. He looked, she thought, different. Not dramatically, not transformed, not softened into something unrecognizable. Still himself, still the contained and deliberate man she had observed from the beginning. But something in him was less braced. Less like a man holding things in place and more like a man who has set something down and found, to his own surprise, that he doesn't need to pick it up again. "The hearth," she said. "Finished," he said, "since March." "The kitchen garden." "Waiting," he said. "I kept the south wall clear." She nodded once. "Then, how is James?" Something happened to his face, the thing she had first seen by firelight, undefended and almost wondering. "He's coming for Easter," he said. "He's written 4 times since February. He wants to know if there's a good place on the grounds to set up a telescope." A pause. "I told him I'd ask someone who knows the grounds better than I do." "The northwest corner," Margaret said immediately. "Above the kitchen garden. The elevation is good and there's no tree cover to the east." He looked at her. "You knew that already." "I walked every part of those grounds in January," she said. "I had a great deal of time to think." "Yes," he said quietly, "so did I." They stood in the hall of Thornfield Manor on a Wednesday afternoon in April, with the spring light coming through the tall windows and Mrs. Beale clattering something distant in the kitchen and Peter having disappeared back to his slates, and the house around them neither too quiet nor too full but simply present. She had conditions, she had told him. She would think of others in Bath. She had thought of them. She took a breath. "I want a proper role here," she said. "Not ward, not companion. Something with actual responsibility, the household accounts, the estate correspondence, the kitchen garden. Something real." "Yes," he said. "I want Peter to have proper schooling arranged. There's a good school in the village and he's more than capable. I'll write to them this week. And I want," she paused, "I want you to keep writing to James, not because I asked you to, because you want to." He was quiet for a moment. "I do want to," he said. "That one you don't need to ask." She looked at him. He looked back. The afternoon light moved slightly across the floor between them. "Those are my conditions," she said. "All of them," he said, a pause, "for now." He took one step forward, not dramatically, not sweeping, just a single step that closed some of the careful distance between them, and said, very quietly, "Margaret." It was the first time he had used her name. She felt it land somewhere in her chest, clean and certain as a key in a lock. "Your Grace," she said. "Richard," he said. She considered him for a moment, this man who had given her the smallest room and the coldest hearth, and had taken 3 months and a snowstorm, and a letter from a 10-year-old boy, and a woman with the patience of someone who had fixed worse things to become someone worth coming back to. "Richard," she said. He smiled. It was not a polished smile. It was not the practiced social expression of a duke at a dinner party. It was uneven and genuine and a little uncertain, the smile of a man who has been a long time without practice. It was, Margaret thought, the best thing she had seen in years. She had come home, not to the room, not to the house, to the choice she had made freely on her own terms with her eyes open. That was the difference. That was everything. Easter Sunday at Thornfield Manor arrived with the particular generosity of an English spring that has decided, after long deliberation, to finally mean it. The grounds were green, properly green, Not the tentative gray-green of February or the cautious green of March, but the full, committed green of April doing its best work. The oak trees along the drive had opened almost overnight, the way oaks do, as though they had been considering it for weeks, and then simply decided all at once. The gravel had been freshly raked. The stone lions at the front entrance wore, for the first time in Margaret's memory, small garlands of ivy that Peter had apparently placed there before breakfast, on his own initiative without being asked. She had found him on the front steps when she came down at 7, ivy still on his hands, looking at his work with the critical satisfaction of someone assessing a completed task. "Well," he had said. "Very well," she had said. He had nodded once, seriously, and gone back inside to find Mrs. Beale. The kitchen garden was unrecognizable from the bare frost-hardened plot Margaret had walked through in January of the previous year. The south-facing wall was lined with sweet peas and climbing roses, just beginning to think about opening, pale pink and deep cream, and one variety of dark red that Mrs. Beale had requested specifically, and that Margaret had tracked down through 3 separate correspondence chains with increasing stubbornness, until she found a nursery in Kent that carried it. The beds along the center path held neat rows of herbs and early vegetables, planted in the first weeks of March when the ground had finally softened enough to work. Margaret had spent 3 consecutive mornings on her knees in the mud with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her oldest dress on. While Thomas stood at a respectful distance and offered commentary, she mostly ignored and occasionally incorporated without acknowledgement, which Thomas seemed to understand was the highest form of approval available to him. The result was, by any measure, excellent. Mrs. Beale had come out to look at it on the first warm day and stood with her arms crossed and her head tilted and said, "That'll do." From Mrs. Beale, that was a standing ovation. James had arrived on Friday. He was 11 now, taller than Margaret had imagined from the letters, with his father's dark eyes and a quality of direct attention that was entirely his own, as though he had arrived in the world already decided to pay close notice to everything in it. He had come down from the carriage with a leather satchel over one shoulder and a rolled star chart under his arm, and had shaken Margaret's hand very seriously upon introduction and said, without preamble, "Father says you know where the northwest corner is." "I do," Margaret said. "Can we go now?" "After supper," she said. He had considered this for approximately 2 seconds, weighing, she suspected, the merits of negotiation, and then accepted it with the practical patience of a boy who has learned that adults have sequencing requirements and that arguing about supper accomplishes nothing. He had then turned and gone directly to the kitchen to find Mrs. Beale, with whom he had established, via several months of correspondence that Margaret had read with considerable amusement, a detailed and ongoing negotiation regarding Easter pie. She had watched him disappear around the corner toward the kitchen and felt something settle in her chest, warm and uncomplicated, and too quiet to need a name. The Duke had been waiting in the hall when James arrived. Margaret had stepped back slightly, not far, not obviously, just enough to give them the space of the moment without making the stepping back visible. She had watched the Duke look at his son getting down from the carriage, and she had seen what crossed his face. Not the complicated grief-adjacent thing she had first observed in the study with the unopened letter, but something altogether different, something lighter. The look of a man who has been corresponding about the moons of Jupiter for 8 months and has been waiting, more than he knew, to see the face that goes with the handwriting. James had walked up to his father and stuck out his hand, formal, prepared, the handshake of a boy who has been at school long enough to know how these things are done. The Duke had taken his hand. And then, after a beat that Margaret would remember for a long time, he had put his other hand on the back of James's head briefly, carefully, the way you touch something you are afraid of breaking, and said something too quiet for her to hear. James had looked up at him. Then he had nodded once with the gravity of a boy accepting something important. Then he had picked up his satchel and his star chart and gone inside to find Mrs. Beale. The Duke had stood on the gravel for a moment after he'd gone. Margaret had not said anything. Some moments did not want commentary. She had simply walked up beside him and stood there, and after a moment he had exhaled a long, slow breath, like a man setting something down, and they had gone inside together. The telescope had gone up on Saturday evening. James had been planning it since February, when he had written to Margaret, separately from his letters to his father, which she had taken as a considerable honor, with a precise set of questions about the northwest corner's elevation, tree coverage, and horizon line. She had answered each one in detail, including a rough sketch of the sight lines, which James had apparently shared with his astronomy teacher, who had written back that the location sounded most promising. The three of them had carried the equipment up to the northwest corner in the long golden light of a spring dusk, James directing with the focused authority of someone who knows exactly what needs to happen, and is managing two assistants of uncertain competence. The Duke carrying the heavier components with the concentrated expression of a man following instructions he doesn't fully understand, but is determined to execute correctly. Margaret bringing the star chart and a blanket and a flask of tea, and the quiet satisfaction of someone watching two people find their way toward each other in real time. James had set up the telescope with practiced efficiency, his hands moving over the components with the confidence of familiarity. He had then proceeded to explain, with considerable thoroughness and no condescension whatsoever, the relevant mechanics, optical principles, and tonight's observational targets to his father, who had listened with genuine and focused attention and asked 3 questions. James had answered each one with visible pleasure, the pleasure of someone who knows a great deal about something and has found, perhaps for the first time, that the person asking actually wants to know. He's been waiting for this, Margaret had thought. Both of them have. She had watched the Duke crouch beside his son to look through the eyepiece, James's hand on his father's shoulder, adjusting the angle with the unself-conscious ease of a child who has not yet learned to be careful about touching, and she had seen the exact moment it happened. The shift in the Duke's posture, the way his head tilted, something in him loosening all at once, like a knot that has been worked at patiently for a long time and has finally, quietly, come undone. She had looked away. Some moments were not for witnesses. She had poured tea from the flask and looked at the darkening sky and listened to the low murmur of a father and son talking about Jupiter, and she had thought, this is what I came back for, not the hearth, not the garden, not even entirely the man. This. Easter Sunday dinner was the fullest the Thornfield table had been since Margaret's arrival. The Duchess of Aldermere had come. She had invited herself, as she did everything, with a letter that said simply, I intend to come for Easter Sunday. I assume this is acceptable. I am bringing wine and I expect to be seated somewhere interesting. She had been seated at the Duke's right hand, which she had surveyed with satisfaction, and immediately used as a base of operations from which to ask him the difficult questions she had promised Margaret she would ask. He had answered them. Not perfectly, not smoothly, not with the polished social competence he deployed at formal occasions. He had answered them honestly, which was considerably better, and the Duchess had listened with her bright eyes and her particular expression of a woman who is recalibrating her assessment upward and finding it a pleasant surprise. The Pembrokes were there, the vicar and his wife, 2 families from neighboring estates who had become genuinely friendly over the winter rather than merely correct. James sat between Margaret and an elderly retired colonel who turned out to share his interest in astronomy, and with whom he had a conversation of such depth and mutual enthusiasm that by the end of dinner they had made plans to correspond. Mrs. Beale had sent up a meal that silenced the table at first bite, the kind of cooking that is so good it briefly stops conversation, which Mrs. Beale privately considered the highest possible compliment. James had 2 helpings of pie and then looked at Margaret, and she had looked at the Duchess, and the Duchess had said it's Easter with the finality of someone closing a legal argument, and James had had a third. Margaret had sat at the Duke's left. Not at the far end, not beside the deaf uncle or the uncertain vicar. At his left, where she had been for the past 3 months, where her place had settled so gradually and so naturally that no one remarked on it because there was simply nothing to remark. It was where she was. It was where she had been. The table had rearranged itself around that fact the way water rearranges itself around a stone, not dramatically, not with announcement, but completely and without the possibility of going back. After dinner, the guests moved to the drawing room. James fell asleep in the armchair by the window with the total and immediate unconsciousness of a child who has had a completely excellent day and has simply exhausted his capacity for more of it. His star chart was still rolled under his arm. Someone, Margaret suspected Peter, who had been watching James with the wide-eyed admiration of a younger boy for an older one all weekend, had placed a blanket over him with considerable care. No one moved him. The conversation arranged itself around his sleeping presence, the way good company always arranges itself around the things that matter naturally, warmly, without fuss. The Duchess won 3 consecutive hands of cards and said absolutely nothing about it, which was how you knew she was deeply pleased. The vicar's wife found Margaret near the window and said, quietly and without preamble, that she was very glad Margaret had come back from Bath, and that Thornfield was a different place for it. Margaret had thanked her and meant it and moved on before either of them had to find more words for something that had already been said well enough. Later, after the guests had gone, and James had been carried to bed still clutching the star chart, which he did not release even in sleep, Margaret and the Duke stood at the window of the drawing room overlooking the kitchen garden in the long spring evening. The sky was doing the extraordinary thing it sometimes does in April, going every color at once, pink and gold and a deep impossible blue at the upper edge, lit from below by a sun that had finally, irrevocably, decided to stay. "The roses will open next week," Margaret said. "I know," he said. "You've mentioned it 4 times. I wanted to make sure you were paying attention." "I am always paying attention," he said. "I was paying attention from the beginning. I was simply," he paused, tried once. "Slow." "You were," she agreed. "Inexcusably so at times." "At times," she said, "yes." He looked at her, that look, the one she had stopped trying to find another word for because the right word was simply his. Entirely and only his. The undefended version. The man beneath the management. The one who had sat with an unopened letter and asked a woman he barely knew whether she thought it was possible to run out of time to avoid the things that mattered. "Margaret," he said. "Richard," she said. He turned from the window to face her properly, with the deliberateness of a man who has decided something and intends to say it without retreating into the careful half-measures he had relied on for too long. "I would like this to be permanent," he said. "You, here, not as ward or companion or household manager or the woman who fixed the hearth and grew things against the south wall and taught my son where to put a telescope, not any category we've been carefully not naming for 3 months." He paused. "I am asking you to marry me. Plainly and without theater, because I think you would find theater irritating and I find it uncomfortable, and because we have been, I think, reasonably honest with each other for long enough now that I don't know how to be otherwise with you." She looked at him. Outside, the sky went on with its colors, indifferent and magnificent. "You left out several things," she said. "Did I? You didn't mention that you are considerably better than you were a year ago, and that you know it and that you know why." A pause. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, not quite humility, something in between. "That is accurate," he said, "and requires acknowledging that I was not previously particularly good." "No," she said, "you weren't." "I know. You also didn't mention James." He was quiet for a moment. "James asked me last night," he said, "whether you were going to stay. He asked it the way one asks about a settled fact that merely wants confirmation. He was eating an apple. He didn't even look up. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I was going to ask you." He paused. He said, and I am quoting with complete accuracy, "Obviously she'll say yes." She fixed the chair. Then he went back to his apple. Margaret looked at the kitchen garden, the south wall, the roses that would open next week, the neat rows of things she had planted in the March mud with her sleeves rolled up. She looked at the sky. She looked at the drawing room behind them where the Duchess had won 3 hands of cards and James had fallen asleep with his star chart. And Peter had tucked a blanket around a boy he'd known for 2 days with the matter-of-fact tenderness of someone who simply does these things without thinking about whether they're his job. She looked at this man. This slow, difficult, entirely worth it man who had given her the smallest room and the coldest hearth and the broken chair and had then, imperfectly and with considerable outside assistance and more time than was strictly necessary, become someone she had chosen to come back to. Not because she had nowhere else to go, because she wanted to. That was the difference. That had always been the difference. "He's not wrong," she said. He smiled. The real one, not the polished social expression of a duke at a dinner table, not the careful, controlled version she had seen in the early months. The uneven one, the uncertain one, the one that arrived slightly surprised at itself, like something that had been out of practice and found to its own relief that it still worked. She had thought, the first time she saw it, that it was the best thing she had seen in years. She still thought so. She thought she would go on thinking so for a very long time. In the corner of the East Wing library, the room that had been a spare room and was now lined with bookshelves, and warmed by a hearth that drew perfectly all the way to the corners. The fire had been burning since morning. The room was everything the original had not been. Warm, well lit, full of books that had been chosen deliberately over time by someone who knew what she wanted and had the patience to find it. The reading table by the window held a lamp, a stack of correspondence and a small sketch, slightly smudged, pinned flat of a kitchen garden with a south-facing wall. And in the corner in its place, the chair. Repaired, cushioned dark green wool, added in November, matching nothing in particular and everything in general. It had a proper carpenter's fix now, the linen wrapping long since replaced, but the chair itself was unchanged. Solid. Good wood as it had always been. The kind of thing that looks like nothing until someone takes the time to see it properly. No one sat in it tonight. But it was there in its corner in the warm room in the house that had learned slowly, imperfectly, with considerable assistance, to hold its warmth all the way through. It had been broken. It had been fixed. It was still here. Downstairs, Peter checked the front door was locked the way Mrs. Partridge had shown him, handle down, bolt across, the way you do it properly, and then stood for a moment in the entrance hall with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose day has gone exactly right. He had a 4th slate now. By summer, Margaret had said, he would have 6. He believed her. He had learned in the past year that she generally meant what she said and said what she meant, and that this was, in his experience, the rarest and most valuable quality a person could have. He went to bed. The Duchess of Aldermere, in her carriage on the road back to the inn in the village, where she was staying the night before returning to Bath, poured herself the last of the wine she had brought, and looked out the window at the April dark going past and thought about the evening, with the satisfaction of someone who had seen something through from beginning to end, and found the ending worth the patience. She had clapped for the girl at a dinner table 8 months ago because she had recognized something, a quality, a particular kind of quiet steadiness, the kind that doesn't announce itself and doesn't need to, the kind that fixes things without making the fixing into a performance. She raised her glass slightly, in the direction of no one in particular. Well done, she thought. Then she finished the wine and closed her eyes and let the carriage take her home. At the northwest corner of the grounds, the telescope stood where James had left it. He had asked, with the gravity of someone making a serious request, whether it could stay set up until morning so he could look at the sky before breakfast. Margaret had said yes. The Duke had said he would go with him. James had looked at his father for a moment, that direct, noticing look, and then nodded once in the way he had of accepting things that matter without making a production of them. He is his father's son, Margaret had thought, in all the ways that count. The telescope stood in the spring dark, pointed at the sky, waiting for morning. The stars went on overhead, indifferent and permanent and extraordinary, the way they always had, the way they always would, whether or not anyone was watching, whether or not anyone had thought to ask why. Someone now had thought to ask. That made all the difference. And in the manner, in the warm rooms, in the house that had been fixed room by room, hearth by hearth, person by careful person, Thornfield settled into the deep and quiet satisfaction of a place that has finally, after a long time, become what it was always supposed to be. Not perfect. Not without its cold corners and its old silences and the particular weight of things that had gone wrong for too long before anyone thought to fix them. But warm. Warm and full and real. And that, as Margaret Ashby, soon to be Margaret Ashford, could have told you from the very first day, was always going to be enough. She had fixed the chair. She had fixed the hearth. She had fixed, gently and without fanfare and entirely on her own terms, a man who hadn't known he was broken. And she had done it the way she did everything, methodically, patiently, without asking permission, and without leaving a single thing behind that was worth keeping. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this Duke story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can join as a member or send a super thanks super chat. Your support truly helps us continue bringing these stories to life. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.